In the shifting religious terrain of 13th century Europe, France stood as both a heart of Catholic orthodoxy and a battleground for ideas that challenged the Church's intellectual and spiritual authority. At the core of this turbulence were the Beguines, a loosely organized movement of lay religious women who lived communally without taking formal vows. The Church, which had long relied on rigid institutional control to ensure doctrinal conformity, regarded such independent female spirituality with unease. Though many Beguines adhered to Orthodox Catholic practice, their theological innovations and mystical aspirations frequently placed them on uncertain ground. The rise of the Beguines must be understood within the wider context of expanding urbanization and religious reform movements across Europe. With cities like Liège, Gien, and Paris growing rapidly, women, particularly those outside the traditional family structure, sought spiritual fulfillment beyond the confines of marriage or the cloister. Beguinages offered a third path. These laywomen engaged in charitable works, lived in semi-monastic communities, and often pursued intense devotional lives, sometimes influenced by radical currents of mysticism. The Church's unease was not entirely unfounded. Some Beguines, while pious, also embraced heterodox theological positions. The line between sanctioned mysticism and heretical deviation blurred easily when women without clerical oversight began to write about direct union with the divine. Church authorities feared that the subjective experiences promoted in some mystical texts could undermine sacramental systems' clerical authority and the hierarchical structure of salvation. Compounding this anxiety was the broader crackdown on heresy occurring across Christendom. The Albigensian Crusade earlier in the century had exemplified the Church's willingness to violently suppress unorthodox belief, particularly in southern France. By the 1230s, the papacy had established inquisitorial mechanisms to root out heretical cells, and by the end of the century, these institutions had expanded in reach and power. In this climate, even subtle theological divergences could incur lethal scrutiny. Marguerite Porete would come of age in this environment of heightened theological vigilance. She was not alone in expressing a deep mystical longing for divine intimacy. Yet unlike the sanctioned visions of canonized mystics, such as Hildegard of Bingen or Catherine of Siena Marguerite's experiences, and more importantly, her written articulation of them, would not be welcomed. Her fate was not simply a product of what she believed, but of how and where she voiced those beliefs, outside institutional structures, outside clerical supervision, and outside obedience. Moreover, Marguerite did not belong to an established religious order with a powerful abbot or bishop to shield her. As a Beguine, she lacked institutional cover. Her solitary stance, combined with a refusal to retract or contextualize her work, would place her at odds with the emerging norms of orthodoxy enforcement. In the eyes of the Church, the danger of such a voice lay not just in its message, but in its medium, a woman outside clerical control, writing theology in the vernacular for lay audiences. The period also saw the proliferation of vernacular religious texts, many of them aimed at laywomen. Though often tolerated, this genre of literature walked a tightrope. Church authorities endorsed some works while condemning others as heretical. Theologians became increasingly concerned with regulating mystical experiences, which they feared could be manipulated or misunderstood when divorced from ecclesiastical interpretation. Into this charged environment stepped Marguerite Porete, whose book The Mirror of Simple Souls would become one of the most controversial theological writings of its time. Unlike many contemporaneous religious texts, Porete's Mirror dispensed with didacticism in favor of allegorical dialogue. It challenged traditional notions of virtue agency and the soul's relationship with God. More troubling to the Church, it advocated for a state of annihilation of the will in which the soul, completely united with divine love, ceased to be bound by ecclesiastical law or moral prescription. These were not idle speculations in a time of inquisitorial rigor. Such claims cut to the heart of the Church's sacramental and moral economy. If a soul in mystical union no longer needed the sacraments or obedience to ecclesiastical authority, what remained of clerical mediation? Who would set the boundaries of sanctity? Porete's ideas seem to unmoor Christian practice from its institutional foundations. While debates over mysticism were common in Parisian intellectual circles, Porete's text was not confined to academic Latin or cloistered disputation. She wrote in Old French, seeking an audience beyond the clerical elite. This democratization of mystical theology, combined with her status as a laywoman without formal education or license to teach, would seal her fate. By the early 1300s, church officials had begun to see not merely the content, but the very circulation of Porete's book as a threat. Yet rather than recant or revise her work, Marguerite would double down. She would continue to disseminate the mirror despite prior condemnation, and when the authorities came for her, she would not defend herself with legal argument or pleas for mercy. She would remain silent. Marguerite Porete's early life is shrouded in uncertainty, a reflection of the broader invisibility imposed on laywomen in medieval sources. Scholars believe she was born in the region of Hainaut, part of what is now northern France or Belgium, sometime in the latter half of the 13th century. While there is no definitive record of her birth baptism or family background, it is likely that she was born into a modest, possibly merchant-class household. What is clear is that she entered the religious life not through a convent, but as a member of the Beguine movement. The Beguines represented an unusual and semi-autonomous spiritual community. Unlike nuns, they did not take permanent vows of poverty, chastity, or obedience. Instead, they chose to live lives of religious devotion, often in communal houses or beguinages, supported by their own labor and charity. Many were literate, a fact that distinguished them from a majority of women in the medieval world. This access to reading and writing enabled some like Marguerite to engage with theology directly, and even to produce original mystical works. Sometime in the late 1290s or early 1300s, Marguerite composed Le Miroir des simples âmes anéanties, or The Mirror of Simple Souls Annihilated. The work is both profound and elusive, structured not as a treatise or catechism, but as a series of allegorical dialogues. The central voices in the text include love, reason, and the soul, which together discuss the path of spiritual progress toward complete union with God. At its heart, the text outlines a 7-stage spiritual ascent in which the soul gradually sheds all attachments, even to virtue and reason itself, until it reaches a state of annihilation where the will dissolves entirely into divine love. This was not a new concept. Annihilation as a spiritual metaphor had appeared in the works of earlier mystics, including the German Dominican Meister Eckhart. However, Porete's articulation was distinct in its tone, scope, and implications. She framed the annihilated soul not merely as passive or surrendered, but as liberated, freed from moral law beyond the Church's sacraments, and no longer bound by external religious obligation. The soul that has died to its will, the mirror proclaimed, possesses nothing, desires nothing, wills nothing, and thus it becomes perfect. For readers steeped in Orthodox theology, these ideas raised alarms. The concept of a perfected soul that no longer needs the Church's mediation contradicted centuries of Catholic teaching. It implied that once a person reached a certain level of divine union, they might be justified in ignoring sin law, or even Christ's institutional church. The implications were radical and potentially dangerous. Despite this, the mirror found readers. Marguerite appears to have traveled to promote her book, likely relying on informal networks of sympathetic Beguines, clergy, and spiritual seekers. The work circulated widely enough to draw ecclesiastical scrutiny. Sometime around 1306, the Bishop of Cambrai reviewed the text, pronounced it heretical, and ordered its public burning in the town square. Porete, however, did not submit. Instead of recanting or ceasing dissemination, she defied the order and continued circulating the mirror even as copies were seized and destroyed. This moment marked a significant shift. The Church's system of heresy suppression relied not only on detecting error, but on eliciting repentance. A heretic who confessed and returned to orthodoxy could often avoid punishment. But Marguerite's refusal to stop sharing her work, even after official condemnation, constituted what the Church called relapsed heresy. For this, the penalties were more severe, and for women like Marguerite who lacked the patronage networks of male theologians or clerical orders, the space for protection grew increasingly narrow. It is worth emphasizing that Marguerite was not simply a passive victim of institutional power. She knew what she was doing and the risks involved. Her persistence in promoting the mirror after its initial condemnation demonstrates not only theological conviction, but a defiant refusal to subordinate herself to ecclesiastical censure. In a time when public orthodoxy was essential to survival, she insisted on maintaining her spiritual authority. The Church, for its part, was entering a period of theological tightening. The 14th century would see growing emphasis on centralizing doctrinal control, a reaction in part to perceived chaos from lay movements and mystical deviations. The Inquisition, originally designed to target groups like the Cathars, had by now broadened its scope. In regions like France, inquisitors increasingly focused on individual suspects, especially those who circulated unauthorized texts. Marguerite Porete soon became one such target. Though her book had been destroyed in Cambrai, its ideas proved difficult to contain. Copies likely continued to circulate in manuscript form, passed discreetly among sympathetic readers. These were not mass-distributed volumes, but each handwritten copy posed a threat to ecclesiastical control. Eventually, her actions attracted the attention of the Paris Inquisition, led by William of Paris, who had been appointed Inquisitor of France by Pope Clement V. By 1308, Marguerite had been arrested and imprisoned in Paris. Her book was already declared heretical. Her refusal to cease its distribution, her status as a laywoman without ecclesiastical oversight, and her continued silence in the face of interrogation marked her not only as a heretic, but as a dangerous one. From the Church's perspective, she was a defiant voice in an age that increasingly demanded submission. The stage was now set for one of the most striking theological trials of the early 14th century. What made it remarkable was not merely the content of Marguerite's book, but her response to prosecution. She did not retract. She did not explain. She simply stood by the work and waited. To understand why the Mirror of Simple Souls provoked such alarm among church authorities, one must examine its theology not merely as speculative mysticism, but as a radical challenge to ecclesiastical control over salvation. Marguerite Porete's writing occupied a dangerous intersection. It used familiar Christian language to advance ideas that, under closer scrutiny, unmoored the soul from moral obligation and institutional oversight. In the increasingly regulated theological climate of the 14th century, this made her not a mystic to be admired, but a heretic to be silenced. At the center of the mirror lay a dialogue between characters such as the soul, love, reason, and truth. Through their interactions, Marguerite described a 7-stage spiritual progression that culminated in the annihilation of the self-will and perfect union with God. At first glance, this journey echoed the broader tradition of Christian mysticism. But unlike earlier mystics who emphasized suffering humility and submission to church authority, Marguerite's soul was unbound. It declared itself beyond the reach of virtue law and even reason, a state in which external obedience was no longer required, because divine will had wholly replaced human volition. This concept of annihilation, the complete emptying of the soul's will to make space for divine indwelling, was not unknown in medieval thought. Theologians such as Meister Eckhart would later explore similar themes, though often with more caution. What made Porete's work unique and alarming was the implication that the annihilated soul no longer needed the Church, its sacraments, or even Scripture. Once the soul reached union with God, it had no need to fast, pray, confess, or obey. It became free in a sense that seemed to defy moral accountability. The book went even further. The soul at the height of spiritual union declares that it is no longer bound by virtues which are described as useful only in the earlier stages of the spiritual path. Once the soul reaches union, even these are cast aside like old garments. This is what scholars have since called libertarian mysticism, the suggestion that the truly enlightened soul transcends moral law. To the medieval church, this was indistinguishable from antinomianism, the belief that God's grace exempts the elect from obeying the moral law, a view condemned as heresy. These were not obscure debates limited to a handful of scholars. The medieval church defined its authority in large part through its claim to interpret and mediate God's will through the sacraments, canon law, and clerical hierarchy. Marguerite's suggestion that the soul could bypass all this through annihilation of the will was a direct theological challenge. Moreover, her book made these ideas accessible in the vernacular, opening the possibility that ordinary laypeople might begin to adopt similar views without clerical guidance. Theologians who reviewed the mirror quickly recognized the stakes. Her vision undermined the sacraments. If the soul no longer needed confession or Eucharist after reaching divine union, what purpose did the priesthood serve? It dismissed ecclesiastical hierarchy if obedience to God could occur internally. Why submit to bishops or popes? It even hinted at spiritual elitism. Those who had not reached annihilation were still bound by law, while the spiritually perfect were free. A theological two-tiered system that resembled condemned sects like the Cathars or the Free Spirit movement. It is worth noting that Porete never claimed her ideas applied universally. Her book focused on rare souls few and far between who had achieved perfect union. Still, the implications were unavoidable. If even a handful of individuals could rise above the church's structures, then those structures were no longer absolute. Her association with the Beguine movement only exacerbated suspicions. Although many Beguines were devout and orthodox, church authorities increasingly associated them with subversive theology. In 1311, just a year after Porete's execution, the Council of Vienne would issue a decree condemning aspects of Beguine theology as heretical, particularly views related to spiritual perfection and the rejection of external observances. While the decree did not ban the Beguines outright, it placed them under suspicion and in some regions led to their suppression. Porete's mirror thus became, in the eyes of many churchmen, a textbook case of Beguine deviation. It blended accessible language with advanced mystical theology, rejected external authority in favor of inner revelation, and proposed a path to sanctity unmediated by the Church. For inquisitors and theologians alike, it crossed the threshold from tolerated spiritual expression into open heresy. Yet not all contemporaries viewed the mirror with hostility. Theologians from certain schools, particularly within the Franciscan tradition, engaged sympathetically with the concept of spiritual annihilation, albeit with greater caution. Some even quoted lines from the mirror in their own works, unaware of its association with a condemned heretic. Manuscript copies continued to circulate anonymously stripped of Porete's name, suggesting that the book's ideas retained a covert following even after her execution. Still, the dominant reaction was condemnation. By 1306, the Bishop of Cambrai had already deemed the text heretical and ordered it burned. This act signaled that the Church saw the mirror not as an unfortunate misstatement, but as a serious and enduring threat. The burning of her book was meant to function both as doctrinal correction and as public warning. Yet the fire did not extinguish Marguerite's ideas. She continued to distribute the mirror in defiance of ecclesiastical orders. This was not simply persistence, it was civil disobedience, a refusal to submit to a hierarchy she no longer recognized as binding. When arrested by the Inquisition years later, Porete did not disavow the book. She maintained her silence and by doing so reinforced the very theology the Church sought to destroy. In a world where silence could mean submission or guilt, Porete's refusal to speak was read as confirmation of her heresy. But it was more than obstinance, it was a final act of fidelity to a vision of God that for her lay beyond the reach of priest laws and inquisitorial tribunals. In the year 1306, the first formal ecclesiastical strike against Marguerite Porete came from the Bishop of Cambrai, a prominent church authority in northeastern France. The bishop's investigation of the Mirror of Simple Souls had yielded a decisive judgment the book was heretical. Acting on this assessment, he ordered all available copies of the work to be seized and burned in the town square. In a time when manuscript production was painstaking and expensive, the public destruction of a book carried symbolic weight far beyond the physical act. This was a ritual of erasure, an attempt to excise dangerous ideas from both public memory and theological debate. The precise language used in the bishop's condemnation is lost to history, but the nature of the charges can be inferred. The Mirror had argued that the soul, upon reaching a state of perfect union with God, no longer needed external commandments, virtues, or ecclesiastical guidance. This, in the eyes of the Church, was an incitement to spiritual anarchy. The burning of her book was not just a censorship measure, it was a public declaration that her theology could not coexist with the established order. What the bishop and other ecclesiastical authorities did not anticipate was Marguerite's reaction. Rather than capitulate, she persisted. Despite the public condemnation and loss of her manuscripts, she continued to circulate the ideas found in the Mirror. Whether she rewrote the text from memory, relied on preserved copies and secret networks, or dictated it to sympathetic scribes is unknown. What is clear is that she refused to renounce or even revise her work. Her theological vision remained unchanged in public. This act of defiance altered the Church's perception of her. In ecclesiastical law, the concept of relapsus or relapsed heresy was especially grave. A person who persisted in disseminating condemned ideas after an official warning could no longer be treated with the leniency reserved for first-time offenders. The penalties were now severe. For a relapsed heretic, the secular arm of the state would be called in to enforce the ultimate punishment, death. Yet, in a paradoxical twist, it was not this initial condemnation that led directly to Marguerite's arrest, but the steady continuation of her theological dissemination, quiet, persistent, and largely beneath the surface. For a time, church authorities may have assumed that the book burning had resolved the matter, but reports of her continued activity eventually reached the Paris Inquisition, and in 1308 she was detained. The decision to transfer her case to the Inquisition was a significant escalation. The bishop's authority in Cambrai had limits. The inquisitorial tribunal in Paris, by contrast, was closely tied to the papal court and enjoyed broader jurisdiction. Led by William of Paris, a Dominican friar and a seasoned inquisitor, the tribunal held authority to conduct extensive investigations and apply the full weight of inquisitorial procedure, including indefinite imprisonment, theological interrogation, and ultimately the recommendation of capital punishment. Marguerite's arrest in Paris coincided with a broader tightening of orthodoxy under Pope Clement V. The early 14th century saw increasing concern over heretical movements, especially those that operated through informal networks or targeted lay audiences. Porete's work, vernacular, mystical, female-authored, and unauthorized, represented precisely the kind of challenge that inquisitors were now trained to identify and eliminate. Following her arrest, she was placed in the custody of ecclesiastical authorities at the Châtelet, a Parisian fortress and administrative center that housed both secular and ecclesiastical detainees. Her incarceration would last nearly 18 months, a prolonged period even by inquisitorial standards. This extended detention suggests not only the seriousness of her case, but the difficulties her interrogators encountered. The primary challenge was her silence. Unlike most accused heretics who either defended their positions or confessed and recanted under pressure, Marguerite refused to cooperate in any meaningful way. She neither denied nor affirmed the charges against her. She offered no clarification of her theological positions, no theological defense, no appeal to authority. She simply withheld speech. This silence, likely grounded in her own spiritual convictions, was interpreted by her inquisitors not as humility or caution, but as obstinacy. In ecclesiastical courts, silence could carry the same weight as confession. The Church's legal framework placed the burden of proof on the accused to explain and correct any theological missteps. Refusal to speak was seen as refusal to repent, and in Marguerite's case, the situation was further complicated by her status as a laywoman. Without the protection of a religious order university or noble patron, she stood alone. Despite these challenges, inquisitors proceeded with building a case. They compiled expert theological opinions, reviewed her writings, and likely gathered testimony from those who had read or heard her book. Still without a formal confession or response from Marguerite herself, the process dragged on. The longer she remained silent, the more her defiance appeared to confirm her guilt in the eyes of the tribunal. In March of 1310, after more than a year of detention, the Inquisition convened a panel of 21 theologians from the University of Paris to assess the mirror of simple souls. This commission represented the intellectual elite of medieval theology. Their task was not to investigate Porete as a person, but to render judgment on the contents of her book. Their verdict was unequivocal. On April 11, 1310, the commission condemned the mirror as heretical. The judgment did not name Marguerite directly, as was common practice when condemning anonymous or pseudonymous texts. But given the context of her arrest, the association was clear. The text had been read, dissected, and rejected by the most prestigious theological minds of the era. From this point on, her fate was sealed. After the condemnation of the book, the Inquisition moved forward with its final steps. Because the Church itself did not carry out executions, it now transferred her case to the secular arm of justice, the French crown. This handoff was more than bureaucratic procedure. It was a final statement of ecclesiastical judgment. Marguerite Porete was beyond redemption, and her body, like her book, was to be consigned to the flames. Marguerite Porete's transfer from ecclesiastical custody to secular judgment marked the irreversible conclusion of her long confrontation with the Church. Once declared an unrepentant heretic, the Inquisition relinquished direct responsibility for her fate and handed her over to the secular authorities for punishment. This division of labor, whereby the Church judged heresy but relied on civil powers to enact the sentence, was a hallmark of inquisitorial procedure. Yet in Marguerite's case, it underscored the paradox of a system that denied the right to defend oneself, while also punishing silence as guilt. The decision to pass her case to the secular court did not occur in isolation. It reflected both the consensus of the Theological Commission and the exhaustion of efforts to elicit a change of heart. William of Paris, the inquisitor who had overseen her detention and questioning, likely recognized that continued imprisonment would not produce a confession. Marguerite's silence, unbroken even after months of confinement, was perceived not as pious restraint but as subversion. She refused to acknowledge the authority of the Church to interrogate or correct her. In the eyes of her accusers, this alone was heresy of the most dangerous kind. What followed was a brief yet solemn civil proceeding. On June 1, 1310, Marguerite was brought before the secular authorities in Paris. Unlike ecclesiastical trials which often took place in private, the final sentencing phase was a public matter. Marguerite was formally condemned as a heretic who had persisted in her error after prior censure. By secular law aligned with canon jurisprudence, this made her liable for capital punishment by burning. The sentence was not uncommon for the time, but the person it was applied to was. Most victims of the Inquisition were men, clerics, preachers, or itinerant visionaries. Marguerite was a laywoman unaffiliated with any religious order and literate in vernacular theology rather than trained in scholastic doctrine. Her case stood out for its singular defiance and for the intellectual clarity of the condemned text. The execution took place the following day, June 1, 1310. According to a chronicler of the period, she was led through the streets of Paris to the Place de Grève, a public square near the Seine traditionally used for executions. Crowds gathered not only commoners but also members of the clergy, city officials, and students from the University of Paris. The spectacle was intended as a warning, a performance of both punishment and purification. The Church had judged, the state had confirmed, and now the flames would cleanse. The mechanics of the execution followed standard protocol. Marguerite was bound to a stake atop a pyre constructed from wood and straw. As was customary, she may have been given a final opportunity to confess or recant. But if such a moment was offered, she did not seize it. No record exists of her uttering any last words. She died as she had lived under trial in silence. Her death marked a tragic culmination not of resistance by force, but of resistance by conviction. In refusing to participate in the trial, Marguerite denied the legitimacy of the entire process. She had already said what she needed to say through her book. To her, the tribunal was irrelevant, her judges unqualified. The only authority she acknowledged was God, and in her understanding she had already united with him. To church officials, however, this posture was not holy. It was heresy distilled, prideful, obstinate, and unrepentant. Her execution was framed as an act of justice and a defense of Christian orthodoxy. It was not enough to burn her writings. Her body too had to be destroyed, lest her presence continue to inspire others to seek spiritual paths beyond the Church's control. Witness accounts are sparse, but it is likely that the crowd stood in somber silence as the fire took hold. Public executions were common in medieval cities, yet they retained a sense of solemnity, especially in cases involving heresy. The condemned were often viewed not just as criminals, but as carriers of spiritual contagion. Burning was thought to purify the soul, or in the case of heretics, to prevent their remains from becoming relics or symbols of defiance. The Place de Grève. Today, a bustling square near Paris's Hôtel de Ville became the silent witness to a rare moment of absolute dissent. Marguerite Porete's body was reduced to ash, but the ideas she had championed would prove harder to extinguish. Remarkably, despite official condemnation, the mirror of simple souls did not vanish. Over the following centuries, it resurfaced in manuscript form, anonymously copied, translated, and preserved. Sometimes the author was listed as a devout soul. Other times she was identified as a woman burned for her faith. In later centuries, theologians, mystics, and scholars would rediscover the text, debating its origins and recognizing its depth. Modern historians have noted how Marguerite's trial illustrates the paradox of medieval orthodoxy enforcement. In trying to suppress dangerous ideas, the Church inadvertently preserved them. The act of condemning the mirror ensured its circulation in secret as both a mystical text and a monument to theological resistance. But in 1310, no such legacy could be foreseen. For the inquisitors and theologians of Paris, the case of Marguerite Porete had ended precisely as it should, in silence, smoke, and ashes. The trial of Marguerite Porete was atypical not only in its theological stakes but also in the way it unfolded. By the standards of the medieval Inquisition, a heresy proceeding often followed a well-defined rhythm accusation investigation, interrogation, confession, or denial and judgment. Marguerite's refusal to participate broke this structure. Her persistent silence baffled the court. It also challenged the foundation of inquisitorial authority, which relied on the spoken word confession, abjuration, or testimony as the primary means of control, correction, and punishment. When inquisitors interrogated accused heretics, they expected dialogue. The process was built on discourse questions followed by elaborated answers, clarifications, theological cross-examination. In many cases, the goal was not execution, but reintegration. A heretic who confessed, repented, and swore to correct their behavior could receive penance often public, but not fatal. Death sentences were typically reserved for the defiant and recalcitrant. And Marguerite, by remaining silent, became precisely that, not simply a heretic, but a persistent one. Records from her trial indicate that she remained in prison for over a year, roughly 15 months before judgment was passed. During this time, the inquisitorial court extended multiple opportunities for her to recant or explain herself. Each time she refused. She did not assert her innocence. She did not defend the orthodoxy of the mirror. She did not name theological authorities in her support. She did not even plead for mercy. Her silence, though unaccompanied by rhetoric, was nonetheless a profound theological act. Some scholars have speculated that this silence was a natural extension of the theology she articulated in her book. According to the Mirror of Simple Souls, the soul that has reached divine union no longer needs to act, speak, or justify itself in human terms. Having surrendered its will to God's, it lives in a state of divine stillness. To speak before a tribunal then would be to reassert her own will, an act that would contradict the very annihilation her book described. From this perspective, her silence was not stubbornness, but fidelity. Yet the inquisitors did not share this view. They interpreted her silence through the lens of canon law, which held that obstinacy in the face of church authority constituted proof of heresy. In some inquisitorial manuals of the period, silence was specifically classified as a tactic of the unrepentant. In other words, to remain mute was to confess by omission. The University of Paris, which played a decisive role in evaluating Marguerite's writings, had become a central authority in policing theological boundaries. With its close ties to the Dominican order and the papacy, it served as both an intellectual engine and a doctrinal watchdog. By assigning a commission of 21 theologians to assess the mirror, the Inquisition gave the university scholars a formal role in the adjudication of orthodoxy. These theologians reviewed the text independently of Marguerite's person. Their judgment focused solely on the content which they deemed erroneous in faith and dangerous in influence. The final report from April 1310 listed a series of theological errors, including the claim that the soul could reach perfection in this life, and thereby cease to observe divine law. Such statements, the Commission argued, threatened to dissolve the moral framework of Christianity. If taken seriously, the mirror could be used to justify disobedience, lawlessness, even spiritual elitism. In their view, the text placed itself outside the Christian tradition. It promoted a false kind of freedom detached from humility, repentance, and sacramental life. It elevated personal experience above revealed truth. In doing so, it gave readers license to discard the very mechanisms by which the Church safeguarded salvation. That the book was written in the vernacular only increased its threat it could reach not only learned clerics, but lay people as well. Following this damning theological verdict, Marguerite's fate rested in the hands of the Inquisitor. William of Paris, though no longer tasked with determining doctrine, now functioned as the executor of church policy. He concluded that she was a relapsed and impenitent heretic, categories that canon law left no room to spare. Accordingly, he prepared the formal writ transferring her to secular custody. The procedure was ritualistic. The inquisitor read the formal sentence aloud. A notary recorded the proceedings. Representatives of the secular government, the prévôt or bailiff, accepted custody of the condemned. By handing her over, the church preserved a legal fiction. It did not execute, only judged. The state, meanwhile, carried out the punishment without shedding blood, as the burning was often euphemistically described in ecclesiastical texts. Marguerite's refusal to respond even in the face of imminent death reinforced her symbolic position. She became for her inquisitors the embodiment of spiritual pride, a soul so convinced of its own righteousness that it defied correction even when salvation was at stake. For others, however, she would become something else entirely. In later centuries, especially in post-Reformation and modern mystical circles, Marguerite's silence would be interpreted not as pride but as a form of ultimate devotion, one that placed her spiritual union with God above her earthly preservation. Her silence, once condemned as heretical defiance, would come to be revered as sacred testimony. But in 1310, there was no reverence in the court chambers, only silence, judgment, and fire. On the morning of June 1st, 1310, Marguerite Porete was led through the streets of Paris under armed escort. The route to the Place de Grève, the city's main execution site, was a familiar one used for public hangings, beheadings, and in cases of heresy burnings at the stake. Yet this morning's spectacle was unlike most. The condemned was not a thief, a murderer, or a rebellious noble. She was a solitary woman in lay dress, accused not of violence but of ideas. It is likely that the crowd present that day included a mixture of Parisian students, clerics, artisans, beggars, magistrates. The University of Paris was mere blocks away, and the condemnation of a heretical text would have attracted theological observers. For the public, the execution offered both morbid spectacle and theological instruction. It dramatized the danger of deviance and the power of the Church to correct it. Whether onlookers believed in the charges or not, they understood the message orthodoxy was not optional. Marguerite was not gagged, nor it seems did she speak. Most records suggest that she remained silent to the end. This silence had defined her trial, and now it defined her death. Unlike earlier heretics who used their executions to cry out defiance or claim martyrdom, Marguerite offered no final challenge, nor did she repent. She simply ascended the pyre bound at the stake and waited. The mechanics of a public burning were grimly efficient. A wooden platform was built to elevate the condemned, ensuring visibility for the crowd. The stake was fixed in the center with bundles of dry wood and straw packed around the base. A brazier or torch would be used to ignite the pile. Once lit, the fire would climb rapidly, consuming clothes, hair, and flesh. Depending on the wind and moisture, death might come within minutes or linger in agony. What went through Marguerite's mind in those final moments is unknowable, but the theological implications of her death echoed with clarity. The Church had not merely condemned a book. It had made an example of the body that produced it. Heresy was not a private error, but a public threat, and it had to be purged publicly. Just as the book had been burned 4 years earlier in Cambrai, so now was the author. The symmetry was deliberate. For the ecclesiastical authorities, this was closure. William of Paris, the Inquisitor, had fulfilled his duty. The University of Paris had upheld its role as doctrinal guardian. The secular arm had performed its obligation. From an institutional perspective, the system had worked exactly as intended. Heretical ideas had been identified, condemned, and destroyed, first in manuscript, now in flesh. But there were those who watched with unease. Not all scholars agreed on the dangers posed by mysticism. Within Dominican, Franciscan, and Cistercian circles, mystics continued to write about union with God, loss of self-will, and spiritual annihilation. Some of their texts, cloaked in Latin and couched in Orthodox language, survived and thrived. That Marguerite had written in vernacular French and as a laywoman made her an easier target, but also raised difficult questions. Was her theology truly more radical or simply less protected? Indeed, what distinguishes Marguerite Porete's case is not that she was executed for heresy, but that she was executed solely for a book. She had not preached in public, gathered followers, or defied the Pope. She had not attempted to found a movement or incite rebellion. Her threat lay in ideas alone, ideas she wrote down, disseminated, and refused to renounce. Historians have noted that hers is one of the rare instances in medieval Europe where a woman was executed entirely on the basis of a written theological work. Her name, while later forgotten for centuries, was inscribed in inquisitorial records and noted by a few contemporary chroniclers, including the monk of Saint-Denis, who recorded her burning with spare language. A certain woman called a Beguine was burned in Paris for heresy. Her name was omitted. This anonymity was strategic. To name her would risk memorializing her. Better to reduce her to a type of Beguine, a heretic, a warning. The suppression of her identity was part of the punishment. If her words could not be erased, her authorship could. And for many decades afterward, the Mirror of Simple Souls circulated in anonymous or misattributed forms. The ideas endured. The name did not. Yet the Church's effort to suppress her was not entirely successful. Copies of the Mirror reappeared in later centuries, often in monasteries or private libraries, copied by hand and stripped of incriminating details. The book was translated into Latin Middle English and even Italian. In England, the Mirror was eventually translated by Marguerite Porete, confessor. In the Low Countries, mystics like Jan van Ruusbroek echoed its themes, though never officially rehabilitated. The text survived, as did its author's silence. In her death, Marguerite became a liminal figure, not quite martyr, not quite mystic, not quite revolutionary. Her case remained obscure until the modern era, when feminist scholars, theologians, and historians began to reconstruct her story from fragments, trial records, scattered manuscripts, and theological echoes. To the crowd on that June day in 1310, she may have seemed merely one more condemned soul mute, bound and vanishing in flame. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. A voice that refused to speak had left behind words that refused to die. In the years following Marguerite Porete's execution, the mechanisms of orthodoxy continued to tighten across Europe. Just 1 year after her death, the Council of Vienne, convened by Pope Clement V, issued new decrees addressing the growing unease with lay female spirituality, particularly the Beguines. Although the council stopped short of outright suppression, it declared that some among the Beguines have strayed from the right path and presumed to preach and dispute about the highest Trinity. The language was cautious but unmistakable. Marguerite's trial had cast a long shadow. These ecclesiastical anxieties reflected a deeper crisis in the Church. The 14th century would be an age of schism plague and escalating suspicion of nonconformity. The institutional response to perceived threats became more severe, and the role of the Inquisition expanded in kind. Yet for all its power, the Inquisition could not entirely prevent the transmission of mystical texts. Manuscripts copied in secrecy or within sympathetic religious houses preserved ideas deemed dangerous. The book Marguerite had refused to renounce would outlive her executioners. The Mirror of Simple Souls began to reappear in manuscript form across Europe in the late Middle Ages. Some versions were heavily edited. Others remained surprisingly faithful to the original. Without Marguerite's name attached, the text found new audiences. In the Low Countries, where mysticism flourished in the Devotio Moderna movement, the Mirror was read alongside works by Hadowitsch and Ruusbroek. In England, it entered devotional circles tied to anchoritic literature and was sometimes mistakenly attributed to male authors. The anonymity that had been part of Marguerite's punishment became paradoxically a shield for her text. By erasing the heretic copyists, unintentionally preserved the heresy. The Mirror would not be printed until 1675, more than 3 centuries after its composition, and even then in a limited Latin edition circulated among monastic scholars. The first full French edition would not appear until the 20th century. It was only then, with the rediscovery of inquisitorial records and the re-examination of theological manuscripts, that scholars began to reconstruct Marguerite Porete's life and legacy. Her silence before the court, once seen as guilt, was reinterpreted as conviction. Her refusal to renounce her work, once viewed as obstinacy, became an emblem of spiritual integrity. Feminist theologians and historians of mysticism took particular interest in her case, seeing in it a precursor to later struggles over religious voice authority and gender. But beyond these modern readings, Marguerite's significance lies in how her life revealed the limits of institutional power. The Church could condemn, imprison, and kill. It could erase names, burn manuscripts, and denounce doctrines. But it could not prevent ideas from moving across time, especially when those ideas touched on the perennial human desire for direct communion with the divine. Her death was meant to be a final chapter. Instead, it became a preface. Even within Orthodox mystical traditions, elements of Porete's theology were echoed sometimes unknowingly. The language of annihilation, of surrendering the will of union so complete it bypassed form, these themes recurred in later Christian mysticism, particularly in the writings of John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, and the English cloud of unknowing tradition. Whether they read Porete's work or absorbed it indirectly, her influence endured beneath the surface of accepted theology. Her execution, however, remains one of the starkest examples of the price that could be paid for intellectual and spiritual independence in the medieval world. Marguerite Porete had no political army, no followers, no institutional power. Her weapon was a book. Her defense was silence. And in the eyes of the Church, that was enough to make her dangerous. Today, her story is remembered not only for its tragedy, but for its courage. She stood by her convictions even when offered multiple chances to save herself. She wrote not to provoke, but to express a vision of divine love that for her eclipsed all earthly authority. That such a vision could lead to execution is a testament not only to her bravery, but to the fragility of freedom in an age of theological absolutism. In the end, Marguerite Porete was burned. Her name was erased. Her book was banned. But her words endured, and in them a soul that chose silence over submission still speaks. The story of Marguerite Porete occupies a unique and unsettling place in the history of medieval thought. Her execution in 1310 was not the result of rebellion, conspiracy, or violence, but of a solitary theological vision expressed in writing and a refusal to recant it. She neither led a movement nor challenged the Church with polemics. Instead, she advanced a mystical understanding of the soul's union with God, so radical and so resolute that it shattered the boundaries of acceptable belief in her time. What makes Marguerite's fate especially disturbing is how little she said in her own defense. Her silence before the Inquisitors was not the absence of conviction, but its final expression. She had already said what she believed in her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls. She would not explain, reframe, or dilute its message. In doing so, she embodied the very theological stance the Church found most dangerous, that of a soul surrendered entirely to divine love beholden to no earthly judge. And yet the very effort to destroy her legacy failed. Her texts survived not in libraries of power, but in fragments, translations, and anonymous copies passed quietly across centuries. Her voice, once silenced by fire, would eventually be recovered and reassessed, earning its place in the canon of Christian mysticism. Today, Marguerite Porete is remembered not simply as a heretic, but as a thinker whose courage and clarity of vision transcended her era. Her life and death challenge us to reflect on the cost of intellectual and spiritual autonomy in times of dogmatic certainty. She reminds us that even in the darkest moments of repression, the written word and the silent resolve behind it can endure far longer than those who try to silence it.